I remain in my shed. Welcome back, Theo. It's lovely to have you back on board.
Thank you.
But we've allowed the B word out of quarantine briefly this morning in the conversation about fruit picking, but it occurred to me that this intervention or expression of opinion by the head of the IMF yesterday about the possibility of an extension was worth a quick explainer from you. I'll put in an early caveat, which is that the woman who runs the IMF these days was very, very positive about the Treasury and the Bank of England's response financially to the crisis, just to nip in the bud any ignorant screams of bias. She had very positive things to say about many elements of the British government's response to the COVID-19 crisis. But then she moved on to the question of this extension.
Yes, she did. Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva runs the International Monetary Fund has said that it would not be wise to add more uncertainty to the economic outlook by deciding not to trigger an extension to the transition period, which of course runs out on December the 31st. Of this year. And that warning, of course, comes as David Frost, who's leading the negotiations for the UK, and Michel Barnier, who's leading the negotiations for the European Union, said that there would be 3 further rounds of negotiations on those trade talks between now and June. And you'll remember that back in February, and at the end of February, Michael Gove, the minister in charge for leading those negotiations for the UK, has said that June the 30th would be a cut-off for the UK, that if enough progress wasn't made in those negotiations, then we would revert to an Australian-type relationship with the European Union. And of course, Australia doesn't have a trade deal with the European Union, and we'd lose that 6 months of trade talks to prepare, or would substitute it to prepare for leaving the European Union on World Trade Organization terms on December the 31st, the transition period. And that, from what Kristalina Georgieva is saying, would be unwise, because it would just add to the uncertainty that faces the economy as a result of the lockdown measures that have been taken by governments across Europe and here in the UK. And of course, earlier in the week, the Office of Budget Responsibility warned that in this quarter, the UK economy could shrink by 35%, which would amount to the worst recession in more than 100 years, although the OBR went on to say that the economy would bounce back fairly quickly.
And as you did say, you did use the word could. It's not a forecast.
No, it's not.
It's a possible scenario. So, I mean, the optics, some prominent Brexit supporters have sort of allowed themselves to finally acknowledge that it's going to be hard and it's going to hurt, otherwise they'd still be arguing that we should crack on with it. They're now saying, well, of course an extension would be a good idea, but the government is still not budging on this. How much of that is policy and how much of it is optics?
At the moment, it's all about the optics of Boris Johnson having delivered Brexit on January the 31st, got the UK out of the European Union. The government does not want to be seen to be suddenly reneging on its promise to get to end the transition period on December the 31st. And it's worth remembering it would require a change in the law, because back when after Boris Johnson and the Conservatives won the election, they tweaked the Withdrawal Agreement Implementation Bill, the legislation that underpins our exit from the European Union, to make it binding, legally binding, that we cannot extend the transition period. So if Boris Johnson and the government, Dominic Raab, who's of course leading the government at the moment, wanted to actually wanted to extend the transition period, they'd have to go back to the House of Commons and put that in a form of legislation to repeal that particular section of the Withdrawal Agreement Implementation Bill. Now, that was primarily designed as a way of making it very clear to the country that the transition period, and to Brexiters within the Conservative Party, that the country was going to end the transition period on December the 31st of this year. And of course, with a majority of 80 in the House of Commons, Boris Johnson and the government doesn't need to necessarily worry about the difficulty of overcoming that particular hurdle that it set itself.
the ERG would change their tune completely from what they were insisting last year. You're suggesting?
Well, they would need to change their tune. Now, of course, what could be different is that what the country faces going into the summer and into the autumn is very different from what anybody could have imagined the country would face in terms of the economic outlook and the hardship because of what has happened as a result of coronavirus.
But as you reminded us at the outset, it was essentially the single platform upon which the entire general election was conducted in December.
Yes. So, yes, it was the single platform, but
But when the facts change, sir, I changed my mind. What do you do? They could say, perhaps.
They could. The Boris Johnson and the Conservatives were very clear that to get Brexit done, we had to leave on January the 31st. But it is, of course, worth reminding everybody that we are still part of European rules and regulations, and of course all the benefits that the European Union has to offer during this transition period. Hence the row a few weeks ago about the ventilators and whether we could have accepted
procurement scheme.
Exactly.
And in conclusion, just to clarify Michael Gove's disingenuousness when he talked about Australia. Australia has lots and lots of trade deals with other territories and other markets.
It doesn't have a trade deal with the European Union.
Just not with the European Union. So
and they would quite like one.
I know, but when he moots the possibility that we could be like Australia in the context of trade relations with the European Union, he conveniently ignores the fact that Australia has trade agreements with many, many markets, and we, on current trajectories, would have precisely none.
Or we would simply roll over those trade deals on terms that we agreed with the we agreed when we were part of the European Union, so that we don't have the benefit. We don't have the benefit of having gone away and negotiated something better because we're not willing to.
No, we'll be lucky if we get to keep it the same way, given that these agreements were negotiated with a market of 500 million people, and we'll be saying, can we have the same terms and conditions for a market of 50 million people that can't even sell?
Yeah, but we do have continuity agreements that have been agreed. I think we're up to about 18 at the moment.
Yes.
At last count, there may have been some more in the meantime.
So not covering services, most of them?
No.
Okay, which is percentage of the British economy, about 10 still, is it? Or is it? Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. We shall see what happens in this field. It's great to have you back, Theo.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be back.
On Twitter. No, it's really nice to hear your voice. My feeling is that they will have to extend it, and I'm not even going to express strong opinions on it because I mean my views on Brexit in general are pretty well documented, but the idea that you'd come out of the worst economic crisis in peacetime history and then embark upon a deliberate plan to impose economic sanctions upon your own population and tear up decades of world-class trade agreements and treaties, even with my deep knowledge of such matters, I can't believe that they'd be that destructive. Even now, I just can't believe it. Not for a minute.
So, will Boris Johnson ask for an extension? Well, I think a better question would be, will the Conservative Party and the Conservative government ask for an extension? The reason I say this is because back in January, I made a prediction that Boris Johnson would be removed from office sometime this year. Now, I said it'd be between this year and the end of the current session of Parliament. But I was considering also this year as a possibility. Now, this was before the current crisis, but I saw some type of crisis coming along that would be an excuse for the Conservatives to remove him. A lot of people in the party are not happy with how Boris Johnson has been dealing with things, and he has upset a great number of people. Now, these people are happy that they have a majority. They're happy that Boris Johnson won the election pretty much on his own because of his own rhetoric, that there is a huge majority in Parliament. So he has done very well for the party. But you have to remember that the party are not happy with powerful figures leading them for a long period of time. Now, there is the exception of Margaret Thatcher. Certain individuals in the party are extremely ambitious and they want to be Prime Minister. Boris Johnson was one of those when Theresa May was Prime Minister, and it has existed for a long time, this backstabbing and this attempt to remove people who get too big for their boots. Now, Boris Johnson has done a great deal of damage in the last number of weeks to the Conservative Party. Many people are extremely upset about how the NHS has been treated by the government. People are upset about how the NHS hasn't had enough PPEs, haven't had enough ventilators, the disaster with the purchase of PPEs and ventilators through the EU scheme, the failures and failures and failures of the current Conservative government. And they are looking for someone to blame. And the party will always protect itself. The party will always protect itself at the expense of any individual member. So they'd be very happy to throw Boris Johnson under a bus. So back to the extension. Is there going to be an extension? I think if Boris Johnson is no longer Prime Minister, the likelihood of an extension increases dramatically. Now, there could be ways that Boris Johnson, if he's still Prime Minister, gets an extension but avoids the political backlash. So, as Theo had said, there would need to be legislation in Parliament in order to ask for an extension, because Boris Johnson had created legislation to avoid that. Now, how would it be done? Well, it would be probably buried on a bad day or on a good day. So, for example, the day the current crisis ends, the end of the lockdown, for example, many people would be focusing on that, and that would be the perfect moment to introduce legislation to ask for an extension. Politicians do it all the time. They call it burying bad news. Now, the alternative is they could be honest with the public and explain the situation and ask for an extension from the European Union, explaining that the negotiations are not going on as well as they would prefer, that there isn't enough time because of this crisis. It would be in the public interest to have an extension. But I don't think that's going to be a likely scenario, because that would require the Conservative Party and the Conservative government being honest with the public. And they don't have a good track record with that. So I think a more likely scenario is they would bury the news of an extension on a day, maybe a positive day or a negative day, I don't know, one or the other, but a day that the public are distracted. Now, the alternative, of course, is not to ask for an extension. And I'm thinking more and more this is unlikely because of the economic damage it would cause. You have to remember that the situation at the moment with this crisis is extremely economically damaging. And the UK will take years, perhaps, to recover from that. Now, there will, of course, be a bounce when the lockdown finishes. But that's not going to reverberate with new jobs springing up all over the place. It's going to be a gradual recovery after the initial bounce. So you're still going to see a lot of unemployment. You're going to still see a lot of economic damage to the country. So the idea of damaging the country once again so early, on the 1st of January, I think this would be a decision that would be too difficult for the party and for the government to take. So what we'll probably see is news that the talks are not going well, talk of an extension being considered, but nothing ruled out, of course. This is typical political speech. And then an extension put through Parliament, but on a particular day that it doesn't appear on the front page of newspapers. I think that's how things are probably going to pan out. But because of this crisis, it's very difficult to see the future. But let's see how things pan out over the next number of months. Let me know in the comments, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are much appreciated. Thanks.